Apulian/Iapygian warfare. Ancient Italy was a period marked by significant cultural interactions and persistent conflict. Various peoples asserted their presence: the Etruscans in the north, the Italics in the center, the Samnites and Campanians in the mountainous regions, and the Greeks establishing colonies along the southern coasts of the peninsula. Raiding for resources was a common occurrence among these groups, highlighting a widespread martial environment. Within this landscape of endemic conflict, the Apulians, and later the Iapygians, who occupied the southeastern heel of Italy, stand out for their deeply ingrained martial culture. Archaeological findings, particularly the extensive warrior graves discovered in the region, suggest that their society was significantly shaped by warfare, with examples of organised siege warfare occurring long before the founding of Rome. Apulia, a region for war. The Italian peninsula was home to many peoples, from the Etruscans in the north to the Samnites and Campanians in the central mountains. The southeastern region of Apulia stands out as a focal point for conflict. Apulia's geographical position was a key factor. Situated on the heel of the Italian peninsula, it functioned as a natural bridge between Italy and the eastern Mediterranean. This location, combined with its fertile plains and rich agricultural resources, made it a highly desirable area for different peoples to settle. The region's dual appeal, as a resource-rich homeland and a strategic gateway for trade, attracted a mix of indigenous groups, migrating populations from across the Adriatic, and Greek colonists. This convergence created a complex environment where multiple peoples vied for control of the same land and resources. Unlike more isolated areas, Apulia's constant exposure to new arrivals and foreign powers meant that raiding and large-scale warfare were endemic. This pressure forced the indigenous inhabitants to adapt, leading to the development of a deeply ingrained martial culture. Archaeological findings, particularly the extensive warrior graves and formidable fortifications discovered in the region, suggest that their society was significantly shaped by warfare long before the founding of Rome. The need for protection and the desire for regional control directly led to the construction of imposing fortifications, which became a defining feature of Apulian settlements. The Apulians were an Indo-European-speaking people who inhabited the southeastern Italian peninsula from the 1st millennium BC until their assimilation into Roman culture by the 1st century BC. While much of our understanding of these peoples comes from Roman and Greek sources, archaeological evidence offers a more direct and tangible insight into their martial practices, societal structure, and the nature of their conflicts. The development of a distinct culture is a result of a blending of local material cultures with traditions brought by Proto-Mesopic speakers who migrated across the Adriatic in the early 1st millennium BC. This convergence created a relatively homogeneous cultural and linguistic community that, after the 8th century BC, began to differentiate into the distinct tribal groups. The study of Apulian warfare, therefore, must consider the evolution of their society from dispersed settlements to fortified city-states, the weapons and tactics they employed, and the broader geopolitical context of their region. Archaeological findings, such as the extensive fortifications at sites like Roccavecchia, provide concrete proof of a society prepared for conflict. The presence of weaponry in male burials and perimortem injuries on human remains gives us a direct view of the violence that was a part of their existence. The analysis of a specific individual, a young male found at Roccavecchia, offers a unique case study that illuminates the brutal reality of siege warfare, the types of weapons used, and the possible role of foreign fighters or settlers. By combining textual descriptions from antiquity with the physical evidence from the ground, we can piece together a nuanced picture of what it meant to be a warrior in ancient Apulia. The rise of fortified settlements and organised conflict. Apulian social organisation underwent a significant transformation over centuries. In the early period, settlements consisted of scattered groups of huts, a stark contrast to the later Greco-Roman tradition of urban centers. Rural inhabitants would gather for shared decisions, religious ceremonies, and, crucially, for defense against outside attacks. This dispersed living arrangement highlights a need for collective security, hinting at the potential for intergroup conflict even in the earliest stages of their development. These settlements began to evolve into more structured forms. The largest of these communities acquired the resources and manpower to construct formidable stone defensive walls. This marked a key shift from rural life to an urbanized society, with settlements asserting their political autonomy. The builders of these somewhat large communal centers were still farmers, however. The apparent need for such large walls suggests that warfare was common and even more violent than normal. The need for protection and the desire for regional control directly led to the construction of imposing fortifications, which became a defining feature of Apulian settlements. The archaeological site of Rocca serves as a prime example of this development. Its massive fortifications, built in the Middle Bronze Age, demonstrate the sophisticated engineering and collective effort required for defense. The site's destruction by a siege-induced fire and the discovery of unburied human remains within the collapsed walls provide compelling evidence of organized warfare. The people of Rocca, whether local or foreigners, with ties to the Aegean world, had clearly invested heavily in protecting their community, only to be overcome by a powerful and persistent enemy. This transition from smaller rural communities to large fortified centers suggests that warfare became an increasingly central part of Apulian life, moving beyond simple raids to encompass structured, prolonged sieges. The shift in social organization and settlement patterns was not simply a cultural development, but a direct response to the escalating nature of conflict in the region. Weapons, armor, and tactics of the Apulian warrior. Based on archaeological finds from graves and depictions on red figure vases, the Apulian warrior was typically equipped with minimal defensive gear. The primary defensive item was a shield, supplemented on occasion by a leather helmet and a jerkin. A breastplate was a rare exception. The most common weapon was the thrusting spear, followed by the javelin, while swords were relatively uncommon. Bronze belts were frequently found in warrior graves, possibly serving a dual purpose as both a status symbol and a form of protection. Given the obvious interaction between the local Apulians and Greeks, it's likely that some cultural exchange happened when it came to weapons and armor, so it is feasible to assume that some forms of Mycenaean armor would have also have been worn, such as boar's tusk helmets. The lightweight and design of these bronze weapons suggest a specific style of combat. Unlike later, more robust iron or steel swords, the bronze blades of the Bronze Age were not suited for heavy, percussive strikes. They were designed for cutting and thrusting, relying on the sharpness of their edges to inflict injury. This is supported by analyses of prehistoric swords, which show that defensive actions, such as blocking, caused more extensive damage to the edges than offensive blows. This type of fighting, a ballet of quick thrusts and parries, may have necessitated the use of a rapier and dagger, with one weapon used in place of a shield. The lack of shields in some burial sites, such as the necropolis of Olmo di Nogara, could be explained by this dual-weapon fighting style, where a dagger served a defensive role. The case of the young warrior from Roccavecchia, RUS 813A, provides a vivid illustration of this martial reality. His remains showed at least 4 perimortem sharp force traumas, all inflicted from behind. The wounds were caused by 2 different types of blades, a medium-long blade, likely a sword, and a short blade, probably a dagger. The fact that the blows were delivered from behind suggests a close-quarters ambush, or the final moments of a battle, perhaps after the warrior had fallen. The use of two different weapons on a single individual could indicate either two different assailants or a single attacker wielding both a sword and a dagger simultaneously, a practice supported by contemporaneous Aegean iconography. The dagger found near the warrior's remains, while not compatible with the specific wounds, showed notches on its tip, suggesting it had been used in combat. This evidence challenges the older notion that Bronze Age daggers were merely for show or status, and confirms their use as functional weapons. The presence of a warrior elite in Apulian society, as suggested by the existence of specific burial sites and the complexity of their fighting styles, points to the professionalization of warfare. Specialized training would have been required to master the use of these weapons, potentially leading to a warrior class that formed a core of the defense or offense of their city-states. The archaeology of violence, siege and battle. Archaeological evidence from Apulian sites offers a direct view of the brutal reality of ancient warfare, particularly the siege. The excavation of Rocca Vecchia is a prime example. The vast destruction layers, signs of a great fire, and the discovery of unburied human remains clearly point to a violent siege. The presence of women, children, and infants alongside warriors, often in defensive postures or positions suggesting suffocation from smoke, paints a grim picture of a total war scenario that did not spare non-combatants. The posterns of the fortifications, once shelters for civilians seeking refuge, became their tombs. The analysis of human remains from battle sites allows us to move beyond mere speculation. The individual RUS 813A, for instance, provides a detailed forensic case study. His perimortem injuries, including multiple sharp force traumas, were consistent with close-quarters combat. The fractures to his scapula suggest he fell from a height, possibly a walkway on the fortifications, before his body was exposed to intense heat and then buried by collapsing debris. This detailed narrative of death, attacked from behind, falling from a height, and then being consumed by fire, is the example of the chaotic and lethal nature of the final stages of a siege. Indeed, it seems that the siege of Rocca Vecchia was so bloody that it left a noticeable mark on the survivors, as there is some evidence that the survivors' way of life drastically changed after the siege, with a change in material culture, architecture, and burial rites. This evidence of a siege at Rocca is not an isolated event. Similar destruction layers and evidence of fire at contemporaneous fortified sites in southeastern Italy, like Coppa Nevigata, suggest that this type of conflict was widespread. The defenders of Rocca, positioned high on their walls, would have had a favorable position against archers and slingers, yet their fortifications ultimately fell. This implies a prolonged siege, requiring significant organization on the part of the attackers. The final close-quarters combat that resulted in the death of RUS 813A likely occurred when the walls were breached, and the two forces met face-to-face. The demographics of the victims also align with the known patterns of ancient warfare. Studies of mass graves from other Bronze Age and classical sites, such as the Tollens Valley in Germany or the mass burials at Himera, consistently show a high proportion of young adult males, the primary combatants in pitched battles. At the same time, the presence of non-belligerents in the shelters at Rocca shows that sieges were indiscriminate in their casualties. This mix of professional warriors and civilian casualties provides a comprehensive view of the societal cost of such organized violence. Foreigners, mercenaries, and the Aegean connection. One of the most intriguing aspects of Apulian warfare at this time is the question of foreign involvement. The Apulians had extensive contact with the Greek world, while these interactions were often framed in terms of peaceful trade and cultural exchange. The archaeological record from Rocca Vecchia suggests that the relationship was more complex and, at times, hostile. The site of Rocca itself shows signs of intense relations with the Aegean world, including the local production of Aegean-like pottery, which has led to the hypothesis that a stable community of foreigners lived there. The discovery of two exotic Aegean-style objects near the remains of RUS 813A, a bronze dagger and a hippopotamus ivory duck pyxis, raises the question of the warrior's identity. Initial speculation suggested he might have been a foreigner from the east. However, isotopic analysis of his bones, which reveals dietary and geographic origins, challenges this assumption. The isotope ratios of RUS 813A were indistinguishable from those of the other human remains at the site, suggesting he was local to Roca. This points to an alternative hypothesis, that he was a second-generation immigrant or a member of a local family with deep-rooted ties to the Aegean community. He may have been fighting to defend his home, armed with an Aegean-style weapon and carrying a precious familial heirloom. This suggests that relations with the Aegean world were not limited to peaceful trade, but also involved conflict, and perhaps the use of foreign warriors, either as mercenaries or as allies. The presence of Aegean weapons and cultural objects in Apulian contexts could mean that foreign fighting styles were adopted and integrated into local martial traditions. The idea of a warrior elite trained in dual wielding, as seen in Aegean iconography, might have been a practice brought to Apulia by these foreign residents. The light bronze weapons of the Bronze Age were well suited for this type of fighting, a style that prioritized speed and precision over brute force. The siege of Roccavecchia, therefore, was not just a conflict between indigenous groups, it was a multifaceted event that involved a community with a composite ethnic and cultural makeup, drawing on foreign resources and martial traditions. The death of RUS 813A provides a tangible link between the local Italian conflicts and the broader world of the Eastern Mediterranean, demonstrating that warfare in the Bronze Age was a transnational affair. Fortifications, logistics, and social structures. The nature of warfare during this period, particularly the reliance on fortified settlements, speaks to a sophisticated understanding of military logistics and social organization. The construction and maintenance of massive defensive walls, like those at Roccavecchia, required a monumental communal effort. This indicates a level of central authority and a society capable of mobilizing large workforces for collective defense. These fortifications were not just physical barriers. They were central to a defensive strategy that aimed to protect the population and their resources. The prolonged nature of sieges, as suggested by the evidence from Roca, also implies a logistical capacity on the part of the besiegers. An army that could maintain a siege for an extended period would have needed a reliable supply chain for food, water, and material. This suggests that the besieging forces were not simply small raiding parties, but organized armies with a clear military objective. Furthermore, the social structure of Apulia was deeply tied to its martial culture. The distinction between a warrior elite and the rest of society is evident in the burial records, where weapons were found in only a portion of male graves. This suggests a specialized component of the population dedicated to warfare, possibly trained from a young age. This specialization could have been a response to the escalating nature of intergroup violence, leading to the professionalization of combat. The evidence of civilian casualties and the use of fortifications as shelters highlight the social consequences of this militarized society. Warfare was not just a concern for the warriors, but affected the entire community. Women, children, and non-combatants sought refuge within the walls, demonstrating that the threat of violence was ever present. The tragic end of the siege at Roca, where these shelters became death traps, underscores the brutal reality that a society defined by its martial prowess was also vulnerable to it. The fortifications that offered protection also became a focal point for destruction. Iapygian warfare in the pre-Roman period. All of this, the establishment of communities, fortified settlements, organised warfare, and the use of foreign fighters, occurred before the founding of Rome. By the time the Romans were busy raiding for cattle, Apulia had seen an influx of Illyrian people, collectively known as the Iapygians. Illyrian and local customs merged, and a distinct cultural identity emerged. However, the Iapygians were not alone. Further south, the heel of Italy was starting to be colonized by Greeks, noticeably a Spartan colony called Taras, which bordered the Iapygians. War would soon erupt between the two people. As Rome was laying its first brick, a centuries-long conflict was about to start. The Iapygian-Tarentine Wars represent a prolonged series of conflicts between the Greek colony of Taras and the three Iapygian tribes, the Messapians, Pusetians, and Dornians. This protracted struggle was not a sudden eruption, but a simmering feud that began almost immediately with the foundation of Taras in 706 BC. The Dorian immigrants, seeking a foothold in Magna Graecia, set their sights on the resource-rich Salentine Peninsula, an area already under the control of the indigenous Iapygian tribes. From the outset, the expansion of Taras was a contested affair, limited to the coastal areas by the resolute resistance of the inland Iapygian populations. The Iapygians, particularly the Messapians, had by this time begun to organize into a confederation of city-states. This political and military cohesion meant that Taras, despite being a formidable commercial power and the leading Greek city in southern Italy, could not simply dominate the region without challenge. The stage was set for a series of battles that would define the regional balance of power throughout the 5th and 4th centuries BC. The first documented conflicts began with an initial Iapygian defeat around 500 BC. This early encounter, however, was merely a precursor to a more significant engagement around 490 BC. The Messapians, eager to reassert their dominance, mustered a composite force of some 8,000 warriors, which included shield infantry, skirmishers, and their renowned cavalry. In response, the Tarentines, a people who evidently retained some of their Spartan heritage, fielded approximately 4,000 hoplites and 1,000 light infantry, alongside a cavalry force that reflected the feudal-like land ownership system of their city. The Tarentines were led by King Aristophilides, according to Herodotus. The battle, fought outside the city walls, was a hard-fought affair. The Tarentines not only endured the initial skirmishing, but also successfully countered the numerical superiority of the Messapian cavalry and their highland charge. Ultimately, the Tarentines secured a victory, solidifying their presence as a leading Greek power in the region. This crushing defeat had a lasting effect on the Messapians, who, according to the records, did not challenge the polis of Taras again for a full generation. The lessons of this first major clash were not lost on the Iapygian tribes, who would return to the field with a new tactical understanding. This early victory allowed Taras to continue its growth, becoming a sovereign city-state in Magna Graecia. However, the initial confrontation had merely postponed the inevitable. The desire for control over the fertile plains remained a constant source of friction, and it was only a matter of time before the Iapygians would gather their forces once more to challenge the Tarentine hold on the region, setting the stage for one of the most significant battles of the era. The political and military dominance of Taras was not absolute, and the Iapygian Confederation, though initially defeated, was far from broken, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The catastrophe at Kailia and its political consequences. The long-standing conflict reignited in 473 BC, escalating to a new level of ferocity in what became known as the Battle of Kailia. This time, the Tarentines faced not just the Messapians, but a united Iapygian force. The city-states of the Iapygian Confederation determined to end Tarentine expansion, allied with the Lucanians, an even more formidable enemy. According to Diodorus, a massive Iapygian force of 20,000 warriors converged on Kailia, a city located southeast of Taurus. The army consisted of 9,000 heavy infantry shock troops, carrying short spears and oval shields, and armed with pectorals and greaves on their left legs. They were supported by 7,000 skirmishers and 4,000 riders, while their allies, the Lucanians, contributed an additional 2,000 warriors. The Iapygians presented a composite and well-rounded fighting force. To counter this overwhelming assault, Taurus forged a new alliance with Rhegion, a neighboring Greek city. The combined Tarentine and Rhegian force was a smaller but disciplined army. It was composed of over 5,000 hoplites, Siloi, and cavalry from Taurus, supplemented by a smaller contingent from Rhegion. The battle began with a volley of slingshots and javelins, a prelude to the deafening charge of the Iapygians into the unyielding wall of Tarentine spears and shields. The Tarentine hoplites, fighting in a phalanx formation, met the charge head-on. The clash was brutal, and Diodorus's brief account suggests a high cost of life on both sides. Ultimately, the Greek phalanx, despite its formidable reputation, proved unable to withstand the numerically superior Iapygian force. The combined Tarentine and Rhegian army was shattered, their remnants fleeing in disarray. Herodotus, the Greek historian, would later describe this battle as the greatest slaughter of Greeks that is known. The losses were immense, with 3,000 Rhegians and an uncounted number of Tarentines killed. The Messapians reportedly advanced as far as Rhegion, an assertion that, if true, highlights the decisive nature of their victory. The defeat at Kailia had profound political repercussions for Taurus. The city's aristocratic government, which had led the army to ruin, was discredited. According to Aristotle, so many aristocrats were killed in the battle that their power was severely diminished. This provided an opportunity for the Democratic Party, which seized power, abolished the monarchy, and established a new democratic government. The political upheaval also led to the expulsion of the Pythagoreans, who had been influential within the aristocratic circles. Despite this crushing military defeat, both Taurus and Rhegion demonstrated a remarkable resilience, continuing to thrive in the aftermath. The Battle of Kailia, while a great tragedy for the Greek colonies, had a significant outcome. It settled the land dispute in favor of the Iapygians for a generation, and fundamentally altered the political structure of Taurus, ushering in a new era of democratic rule. A turn of the tide, victories and shifting alliances. The Iapygian military dominance, established at the Battle of Kailia, was further solidified with another victory against Taurus in 466 BC. This defeat continued the process of political change in Taurus, as the democratic movement, having gained power, became more entrenched. However, a decade after the catastrophe at Kailia, the Tarentines, now under a new government, prepared for another confrontation. Around 460 BC, near the Iapygian city of Hieria, a new battle unfolded. This time, the Tarentines were confident enough to face their rivals alone, their forces bolstered by a new sense of purpose. They were opposed by a smaller Iapygian army, which included a Pusitian force and an army led by Opis, the king of the Messapian state. The Battle of Hieria was a more evenly matched affair. The Pusitians numbered around 3,000 men, while Opis's army consisted of some 4,000 spearmen. The Tarentine forces, composed of a formidable hoplite infantry and a strong cavalry arm, proved superior on this occasion. In a decisive moment, King Opis himself was killed, a significant blow to the Iapygian cause. This Tarentine victory effectively ended the prolonged battles between Taurus and the Iapygians for a full generation, allowing for a period of relative peace in the region. However, the delicate balance of power was once again disturbed in circa 440 BC. The Messapian city-state of Brindisi entered into an alliance with the Greek city of Thurii. Their combined army was led by Cleandridas, an exiled Spartan general who had been banished for accepting a bribe from the Athenians. The Brindisi-Thurii army, with their new Spartan leadership, met the Tarentines in the disputed area of Ceres. Although they had fewer hoplites, their forces likely included a greater number of cavalry and light troops. Despite their advantage in leadership and a strong composition of forces, the Brindisi-Thurii army was unable to penetrate the Tarentine lines and was ultimately defeated. Despite this setback, the alliance between the Messapians and Thurii continued, as they would later unite again in 433 and 432 BC to counter the growing threat of Lucanian invasions. The regional conflicts soon became entangled with the larger geopolitical struggle of the Peloponnesian War. Taras, maintaining its Spartan roots, sided with the Peloponnesian League against Athens. The city refused to grant anchorage or water to the Athenian fleet in 415 BC, and even sent ships to assist their Peloponnesian allies after the Athenian disaster in Sicily. In response, Athens sought to counter Tarentine power by forming an alliance with the Messapians. The Athenians aligned themselves with Artus of Messapia, a move that was an overtly anti-Tarentine and anti-Spartan act. Artus, who was a proxenos of Athens, renewed his friendship with the Athenians in 418 BC, and even supplied them with 150 javelin throwers in 413 BC for the war against Syracuse. This strategic alliance with Athens helped Artus elevate the Messapian state into a significant military and political center within the affairs of Magna Graecia, ensuring that the conflict with Taras would continue to play a role in the wider theatre of Greek history. A new common enemy and the end of a prolonged struggle. The 4th century BC marked a significant turning point in the conflicts of southern Italy, as the region's political landscape was reshaped by new and formidable threats. The long-standing rivalry between the indigenous Iapygians and the Greek colonists of Taras, which had defined the balance of power for centuries, began to shift as external pressures grew. In 356 BC, a Messapian and Lucanian alliance demonstrated their military strength by conquering the Greek cities of Heraclea and Metapontum. This act of aggression prompted Taras to seek foreign assistance. They turned to Sparta, appealing to their shared Dorian heritage, which led to the intervention of King Archidamus III. Archidamus III arrived in Italy with a Spartan force to aid the Tarentines against their Iapygian and Lucanian enemies. His campaign, however, ended in a decisive defeat. In 338 BC, he was killed in battle beneath the walls of the Messapian city of Manduria. His death was an example of the military prowess of the Iapygian forces, who proved they could stand against and defeat one of the most respected military powers in the Greek world. The Iapygian victory was not just a local success. It highlighted the limits of foreign intervention and forced Taras to continue seeking outside help to protect its interests. Following Archidamus' death, Taras faced mounting threats from the Iapygians and other regional groups. The city once again appealed for assistance from the Hellenic world, this time calling upon Alexander the Molossian, the king of Epirus. Alexander, who was the uncle of Alexander the Great, arrived in Italy between 333 BC and 330 BC. He initially secured victories against the Messapians and Lucanians, providing a brief period of relief for Taras. His efforts, however, were cut short. Alexander the Molossian himself was killed in battle, a fate similar to that of his Spartan predecessor. His death highlighted the persistent and dangerous nature of the conflicts in Magna Graecia, where even a skilled commander from the mainland Greek world could not secure lasting peace or dominance. The deaths of two prominent Greek warriors left a political military vacuum into which a new and far greater power expanded from the north: Rome. The burgeoning Roman Republic had been steadily extending its influence southwards, a movement that represented an existential threat to both the Iapygians and the Tarentines. This shared danger served as a catalyst, forcing the two long-standing adversaries to reconsider their relationship. The centuries-long rivalry, fueled by disputes over land and resources, came to an abrupt end as they recognized the necessity of uniting against a common enemy. This newfound alliance between the Messapians and the Tarentines was solidified in a series of anti-Roman campaigns. For instance, the alliance with Cleonymus of Sparta in 304 BC was part of a united front against Roman expansion. The recognition that Rome represented a danger greater than their internal squabbles led to unprecedented cooperation. The conflicts that had raged for over 400 years, born from the initial clash over land and resources, were finally superseded by a struggle for survival. The Iapygian and Tarentine alliance represented a strategic shift away from regional disputes towards a larger existential fight to preserve their independence against the formidable power of Rome. However, even this united force was not enough to stop the might of Rome, and both powers would eventually surrender, with the Messapians in particular becoming loyal subjects of the Romans. Conclusion. The history of Apulian warfare reveals a society where conflict was a constant and evolving force, shaping everything from their settlements and social structures to their military tactics and foreign relations. From the scattered communities of the early Bronze Age to the fortified city-states of the pre-Roman period, the Apulians were a people for whom defense and organized violence were a central part of life. The archaeological record offers a unique and detailed perspective on this martial culture. Forensic analysis of a single warrior's remains at Rocca Vecchia provides a vivid narrative of a violent death, showing the types of weapons used and the brutal reality of siege warfare. The evidence of a community with ties to the Aegean world adds a layer of complexity, suggesting that Iapygian warfare was influenced by foreign traditions and possibly involved foreign fighters. The Iapygian military history is not simply a story of defeat. They had a sophisticated military tradition, capable of both internal conflict and strategic victories against powerful external forces. This is demonstrated by their successes against the Greek colony of Taras, including the crushing defeat of a Tarentine and Rhegian army at the Battle of Kailia in 473 BC. These conflicts were not isolated events, but a long-standing feud that shaped the political landscape of southern Italy for centuries. Ultimately, the long-standing hostility between the Iapygians and Tarentines came to an end with the rise of a new power: Rome. The shared existential threat posed by the expanding Roman Republic forced these old adversaries to ally, superseding centuries of conflict with a new struggle for survival. The tangible evidence of their martial culture, preserved in the earth and bone, provides a clear record of a society that lived, fought, and died in a world defined by the sounds of bronze and the roar of battle.